enter a new millennium, no issue is more explosive or controversial than race. But as we've already seen in our class, modern conceptions of race are a relatively recent invention. They are a product of the late 18th, 19th centuries, when Europe was beginning to increase its dominance across the entire world. If we could have the computer screen, please. Over time, in fact, the number of racial categories has actually decreased. We no longer speak about an Aryan race. We no longer talk about a Nordic race or a Hebrew race. In short, biological and genetic definitions of race have long been discredited. The arbitrary nature of race can be underscored when you compare North America and Latin America. In North America, a Negro is anyone with any amount of African ancestry. In Latin America, we saw there are various categories depending on degree of racial intermixture. So, race is a social and cultural construction. It is an invention. But just because it's an invention does not mean that it's not real. Race influences perception, including self-perception. Above all, racial identities represent shared historical experience and create shared communities of meaning. So being black in U.S. society exacts a real price. If you are an African American, you are twice as likely to grow up in poverty. You have half the chance of going to college, less than half the chance of entering a profession, twice the chance of being jobless, and 8 times the chance of being murdered. Early in the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, famous black sociologist, called African Americans the last of the immigrants because he believed at the time that African Americans would follow the same road that had been paved before by other European ethnic groups. But his comparison proved to be entirely incorrect. Unlike all other immigrant ethnic groups, even today, the degree of intermarriage is the lowest among African Americans. You have the highest degree of residential segregation, the highest extent of occupational segregation. In other words, even as the 20th century draws to a close, a caste-type system seems to persist in the United States. And to understand this, many specialists in African American studies have increasingly turned to the concept of internal colonialism. Now, we've spoken a lot in our class about colonialism, and it has 2 classic characteristics. The first is economic, that is, extracting wealth or labor or resources from a particular people. The other feature of colonialism is cultural. It involves close regulation over a people's lives and dominance over their culture. In certain respects, as our speaker today will explain later, the experience of African Americans in U.S. history resembles that of a colonial situation. That is, throughout American history, African Americans have tended to occupy the lowest rungs of the occupational ladder. They have been confined to separate neighborhoods, isolated from better jobs, stores, transportation, schools. The dominant institutions in our society tend to reinforce Anglo-Saxon ideals. So most of our churches worship a white deity. Our advertising highlights white ideals of beauty. Our culture tends to emphasize white examples of achievement. Even our law enforcement seems to be racially specific, about 1/8 of all African American young men are arrested every year. These conditions, of course, did not arise out of no place. They are a direct consequence of history, of slavery, of sharecropping, of debt peonage, of exclusion from the industrial economy, and discrimination in housing and lending. Today's decaying inner-city ghettos are the culmination of a long process of ghettoization and economic exclusion. So as we enter into a new century, I think we are all struck by a paradox. On the one hand, African Americans are more visible in our culture than ever before, in music, TV, film, sports. Many of our leading cultural icons are African American, like Michael Jordan. And yet, racial polarization has in some respects grown deeper. Black youth in particular are often demonized. The deepest paradox, and one of the most troubling, is that while there are more black scholars, black intellectuals than ever before, a distinctive African American world of black newspapers, magazines, colleges, theaters, movie studios has gradually eroded over time. Today, we are very fortunate to have two speakers with us who will speak about the African American experience in the 20th century United States. Our first speaker is Tyrone Tillery, who will speak on black social thought and black protest in the 20th century. Professor Tillery is a prize-winning teacher. He won the highest teaching award at the University of Oregon before he came to the University of Houston. He's also a prize-winning author. He recently published a book entitled Claude McKay, A Black Poet's Search for Identity, which won the Gustavus Meyer Award for the outstanding book in Human Tolerance in America. It is a great personal pleasure to introduce Tyrone Tillery.
Thank you. Each time that I begin the semester teaching African American history, I would like to come into my class and say that what we're going to talk about today is, in a real sense, history. That these are things that happened years ago, and we're looking at them from this historical perspective. But unfortunately, in terms of African American history, it has an enduring quality about it that seems that it will not go away. In some ways, I have compared it to a living history, because many of the things that I discuss in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and the 19th century, and even in the 20th century are still with us today. There is this sense of continuity in African American history. Now, of course, African American history is American history, and we ought to point that out. It is just that it is a particularization of American history. It is a history unlike some of the other disciplines within my area that probably has an emotional quality that is hard to match. And any scholar and any teacher who approaches the discussion of African American history must do so with the greatest sensitivity and concern for all the students that the individual speaks to. For instance, I do not believe that in spite of all the terrible things that one will have to face and confront in looking at African American history, that it is not to be used as a hammer to beat groups over the head with. That is not the function of history. I often begin my class by pointing out that history really is the study of past human behavior. It is a study of those aspects of human nature, their strengths, their weaknesses, altruism, self-interest. These are the things that create history, the good and the bad. Rarely is there black and white when it comes to any presentation of history. And if history then is the study of past human behavior, then it is the study of attitudes. And if we look at, particularly in terms of African American history, in terms of attitudes, if we're able, and this is my goal, and it ought to be the goal of every historian, I think, who looks at African American history, the goal ought to be using information, using understanding, because at the bedrock of racism and interracial conflict often is misunderstanding, an admixture of fact and fiction. That once we create a climate in which we dismantle these erroneous notions and ideas, we are able to change attitudes which will change behavior and hopefully will change the future of our country. So that one day I will be able to walk into a classroom and indeed say that this is really, in a very literal sense, history. But that day has not come yet. And so we continue to look at African American history toward the goal of changing attitudes, changing behavior, and creating a new America, a one nation. Just the other day, you cannot pick up a newspaper. It is hard to pick up the Houston Chronicle and not see some reference to race or racism or antipathy between the races that continue in 1997. Just the other day, there was an article on the emergence of the so-called new Black Panther Party that we'll touch on as we look at the 60s in a moment. That was a tragic story of a youth who was allegedly a black youth, shot by a white father because he was dating his white daughter, and he disapproved so strongly that he shot the child because of it. That those feelings went so deep. Or, who can get away from this discussion of O.J. Simpson, which has so captivated and in some ways paralyzed the nation, and in a sense revealed that we have not come nearly as far, in spite of all the things that Dr. Mintz mentioned in terms of our society, that we have not come far enough in changing those ideas and those attitudes. Sometimes looking at black history is an overwhelming pursuit. He mentioned the book on Claude McKay that I wrote several years ago. And I remember Claude McKay writing once that this race thing was maddening. That he could not go anywhere, and he certainly tried. He left the United States, he went to Africa, he went to Paris, he went everywhere to escape the discussion of race, and there was nowhere he could go. And after a while, he said it was absolute madness. The other person, I think, who captures this tragic sense of race in our country, was W.E.B. Du Bois, who Dr. Minch mentioned. I don't think anyone has captured the sense of what race has meant to America than Du Bois. In his 1903 book, Souls of Black Folks, he states very clearly, very eloquently, what the problem was in America at the turn of the century and the problem in America in 1997. He said that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. And that what he hoped for African Americans was that they would be able to achieve their goal. And this goal has not changed since 1903. It is the same goal today, the same objective. And what is that objective? As Du Bois so eloquently put it, that all he wanted and all African Americans wanted was to be able to be both a Negro and an American without having the doors of opportunity slammed shut in their face. It was just that simple. That he did not want to lose his identity with Africa, because as he put it, Africa had much to offer the world. But that he did not want to lose those things that white civilization contributed to America too, because they both had much to teach the world. And why could not the two coincide and live together in harmony? No one, I think, has created the symbol of this separateness between black and white better than Du Bois when he talked about this notion of the veil of color. You know, a veil is a sheer, almost transparent article. You can see through a veil, but yet it still has substance. It still has the quality of concrete in terms of race itself. And that as sheer as this veil of color was, it had a permanency that today we have not been able to lift. And that has been the goal, if you will, of most scholars, most social scientists, is to lift the veil of color. Du Bois, like most scholars, believed that education was crucial to creating better race relations. He began his career as a scholar by refuting old, outdated misconceptions about the African American. He hoped that that would bring about a new appreciation of the African American. That this would help lift the veil of color. But even Du Bois, by the 1950s, became so despondent that race relations had not changed qualitatively that he made the following statement. And then the veil of color, it drops as drops the night on southern seas, vast, sudden, unanswering. There is hate behind it, cruelty, and tears. As one peers through its intricate, unfathomable pattern of ancient, old design, one sees blood, and guilt and misunderstanding. And yet it hangs there, the veil between then and now, between pale and colored and black and white, between you and me. Surely it is but a thought thing, tenuous, intangible, and yet just as surely it is true and terrible, and not in our little day may you and I lift it. We may feverishly unravel its edges and climb slowly with giant shears to where its ringed and gilded top nestles close to the throne of eternity. But as we work and climb, we shall see through screaming eyes and hear with aching ears lynching and murder, cheating and despising, degrading and lying, so flashed and flashed through this vast hanging darkness that the doer never sees the deed, and the victim knows not the victor, and each hate all in wild, utter ignorance. That truly captures the essence of race relations, utter ignorance in which people really do not know why they fight, why they cannot achieve the kind of harmony. It is clear that this was the state of affairs in 1900. In 1900, you see that there is a transition in terms of race relations. Actually, if we want to look at race relations in the way that I presented in class, it is a series of adjustments. We could put the entire African American experience in 3 adjustments. 1, moving toward the dominant society, which means to become a part of the mainstream, to integrate, to become a part of the great American melting pot. And that has been the major thrust among African Americans historically, and certainly in the 20th century. A second adjustment, and these adjustments are made in the sense they are adjustments to what is an overwhelmingly hostile environment. The second adjustment was to move away from the dominant group. And what we will see today is that even these things will come up periodically, as sometimes they're more important than at others, but they're always there, these adjustments. Moving away. There are those who believed in 1900 and believe today that race relations will never be inclusive enough to include the African American. And that the only hope for the African American is to move away from the dominant group. This was often expressed in terms of exodus, either out to areas where whites were not, as in the exodus of 1879, or most commonly, movement out of the country and back to Africa. That is always present, this notion of returning home to the motherland that we'll see, certainly and particularly in periods of stress in race relations. The advocation of leaving America will become most conspicuous. And then the third adjustment, moving against the dominant group. Now, this one is a little more complicated because you can move against the dominant group, or you can move against racism or hostility in several ways. Obviously, there are those who would advocate, and these have always been in the minority. Make no mistake about this. You can move against the majority group in terms of violence. And there's always been the advocacy of revolution against the dominant group. Either in terms of defensive violence or offensive violence. But you can also move against racism and discrimination in other ways, in nonviolent ways, as we'll see with the Niagara movement in a moment, the NAACP, and certainly in the 1950s, the advocacy of nonviolent direct action. It is moving against to be included. If you look at the entire 20th century, you can fit anything that happens within these parameters in one of these three adjustments. At the turn of the century, I mentioned that it is an era of transition. Between 1880 and 1915, the dominant adjustment to racism, the adjustment to the overthrow of Reconstruction, the adjustment to the rise of the new racism, the new imperialism, that the adjustment to the social, political, and economic and legal disfranchisement of blacks between 1880 and 1915 was advocated by the head of Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Pharaoh Washington, sometimes called the Wizard of Tuskegee. By 1900, there are those who believe that accommodation, which essentially meant you would accept the status quo, you would accept second-class citizenship, or at least you would not push for things that Booker T. Washington felt were non-essential at that point. Political participation, he argued, could come later. Liberal arts could come later. The agitation for civil rights and political enfranchisement could come later. That these should be subordinated to an economic program characterized by industrial education or manual training. But by 1900, it was clear. It was increasingly clear to people like W.E.B. Du Bois that the so-called Atlanta Compromise, it was called the Atlanta Compromise because in 1895, Booker T. Washington was the first African American invited to speak in Atlanta, Georgia at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition. And that there he summed up his program for Black America. Many blacks were willing to hope that this was a compromise that would lead to a greater participation within American society. But by 1900, it was clear, and even Du Bois supported Booker T. Washington until around 1900. He believed that the Atlantic Compromise was a first step. And while he had some problems with some of his philosophy, that it was the beginning But by 1900, those things that Booker T. Washington advocated that would come to pass by casting down their buckets where they were had not come to pass. That accommodation bred increasing contempt for African Americans. It sped up the disfranchisement movement. It helped create caste in the South, a caste system that was certainly very much like that it existed in India itself. Or as the historian U.B. Phillips put it, that Jim Crow would be the final solution. It would put the black man in his place. It would be the final solution to the problem of race relations. In 1900, for instance, there were 100 lynchings in America. Ironically, between the period that we call the age of accommodation, between 1880 and 1915, there were more than 3,500 blacks lynched in America. More than 5 blacks per week. Obviously, Du Bois, and even actually earlier than Du Bois, another black individual who normally goes without mention in his history books, the first black Phi Beta Kappa of Harvard, William Monroe Trotter, who in fact gave up a fortune to simply create a newspaper to fight what he called the pernicious and destructive philosophy of Booker T. Washington of accommodation. By 1900, Du Bois, people like Trotter were now arguing that they were at a crossroads. Accommodation had failed. And now it was time to go back to what Frederick Douglass had said in 1895. In 1895, Frederick Douglass, right before he died, expressed severe reservations about Washington's program and said that it was time now to return to an era of protest. So as a result of this, in 1905, you have the first all-black organization to not only denounce Booker T. Washington's accommodationist theories and ideas, but to launch a new era of protest. I recall reading Du Bois's description of the Niagara movement. It was called the Niagara movement because they chose to meet at Niagara Falls, which was the terminus for the Underground Railroad, so it had that symbol. It's interesting to note that when they were creating the Niagara movement, Du Bois and Trotter sent out more than 100 invitations to black leaders all over the country to meet with them at Niagara Falls. But only 28 showed up because they were afraid. They were fearful of running afoul of Booker T. Washington, who controlled any wealth that came through the black community. He has been called by many sociologists as a symbolic leader. He was a creation of the white power structure, and that is where his power flowed from. And it was true, you could not hope to obtain a job in federal patronage. You could not hope to get a subsidy for a newspaper, nor if you were a president of a university, you could not hope to get a grant unless you had the approval of Booker T. Washington. But the Niagara movement met to issue their own demands and signal now another adjustment. As Du Bois recalled, he said, even though there were few of us, many had stayed away. The atmosphere was charged with emotion and optimism. That they had not convened to ask for anything from the country. They had convened to make demands upon American society. And those demands were simply equality of opportunity. I think that is crucial to understand that until the 1960s, the one consistent objective that blacks sought in America was not preference, but was simply an equal opportunity. When we look at affirmative action in the 60s, we'll see how that changes and creates even more difficulty for race relations. But the Niagara movement, they demanded the end to caste. They demanded the end to the political exclusion of blacks. In other words, they demanded universal manhood suffrage. They also believed, and this was a jab at Booker T. Washington, they believed that education, the highest form of education, was not the monopoly of one group, of one caste, class, or one race in America. That everyone ought to have the ability to pursue their talents as far as their individual abilities would take them. And that industrial education, common school education, was going in a direction that was opposite from the Industrial Revolution or in terms of where the rest of America was going. And they did not want to see blacks be left behind. They did not oppose industrial school education or common school education. They simply said it ought not be the sole basis of education for blacks in America. The Niagara movement, for all of its good intentions, by 1909 really had not done much. It had set, perhaps, it had created a moral sense of outrage. It had created a program that was certainly desirable but unobtainable by those 28 members of the Niagara movement. They simply did not have the resources. And so while they were struggling, race relations in America continued to deteriorate. Race riots in 1904 in Statesboro, Georgia, in Brownsville, a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, and then in 1908, the famous and the most destructive race riot to date, and one not in the South, but in the North. The Springfield race riot of 1908 had a catalytic effect on this new adjustment to racism and racial hostility. There were a number of whites in America who were profoundly disturbed by the Springfield race riot. One of them was William English Walling, who wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post in which he said the time had come where caste was not only confined in the South, caste and anti-black feelings were not only confined in the South, but they were now finding their way northward. After all, Springfield, Illinois was the home of Abraham Lincoln, the symbol of freedom for many blacks. If it could happen in Springfield, Walling said, it could happen anywhere in America, and that America would now have to stand up together and face this cancer. He called upon all Americans, black and white, to revive the old abolitionist spirit, to create a neo-abolitionist movement, one dedicated to the dismantling of caste in the South, one dedicated to convincing the American people that if there was hope for America in the future, it would be based upon accepting the African American on a plane of absolute equality. His article so moved so many people. One in particular was a wealthy white social worker by the name of Mary White Ovington, a New York social worker. She was so affected by Walling's article that she issued a call for all of those who felt the same way that Walling felt, a call to come together to create an organization which would achieve the end of caste in America. Out of that organization, out of that meeting, came the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in America. Unfortunately, I think, in today's society, we have forgotten, and I think it is tragic, we have forgotten the contributions of whites to early 20th century protest. Because without those dedicated whites, like Mary White Ovington, Oswald Garrison Villard, John Milhowland, and many others, Joel Spingarn, Arthur Spingarn, it is doubtful that this new adjustment would have been successful. The NAACP was established as a biracial organization. They invited all of the Niagara people to join. Only one declined, and that was Trotter. Trotter had come to become so bitter about race relations that he simply decided that he would not. He had come to the point where he could not trust whites, which was tragic. And Booker T. Washington, who politely deferred, arguing that his program was probably the better one for African Americans, not protest. But out of these two groups, the NAACP created a program that was referred to as non-economic liberalism. Non-economic liberalism. That while the NAACP members understood that ultimately, in the end, there could be no progress for African Americans, there could be no equality for African Americans unless there was economic equality, they felt that it was best at that point to concentrate on a program which would dismantle the legal and statutory barriers that undergirded caste or second-class citizenship in America. It initiated an era of legalism in which the NAACP would select certain cases that involved the denial of fundamental constitutional rights of blacks. The NAACP was extraordinarily fortunate to be able to obtain the services of some of the country's most outstanding constitutional lawyers. Moorfield Story, a white lawyer, Lewis Marshall, a Jewish lawyer, were all considered some of the most outstanding lawyers in this field. Even Clarence Darrow worked for the NAACP at one point. Using this program of non-economic liberalism, using the courts to dismantle violations of the 14th and 15th Amendment, and using the whites who volunteered their time because they were not paid. Lewis Marshall was never paid for a case that he took to the Supreme Court, nor was Moorfield Story, nor were most of the other lawyers who took those cases, because blacks had a very difficult time functioning in the courts at this point because they were disrespected by the judicial system. But even if they were allowed, these were men who were at the top of the professions. When they got ready to argue a case before the Supreme Court, they knew the judges firsthand. It always helps when you can refer to a judge as Felix on the Supreme Court. How's the wife? Will I see you at dinner tonight? That's always important. It ushered in an era of unprecedented successes. The establishment of legal redress using these lawyers. In the first 5 years, one case after another they were successful. Without going into all the cases itself, in 1915, in U.S. versus Guinn, G-U-I-N-N, the NAACP was able to get the Supreme Court to declare the infamous grandfather clause unconstitutional, arguing that it was a thinly veiled attempt to circumvent the intent of the 15th Amendment. In another case, they were able to get rid of residential segregation in Buchanan versus Wall in 1917. In 1927, in Nixon versus Herndon, a case that originated here in the Lone Star State, the NAACP was successful in having the all-white Texas primary declared unconstitutional. This was a primary that did not allow blacks to vote in. It was the most important election, because if you can't vote in the primary, you can't have a say in who wins in November. And in the South, there was only a one-party system anyway, so it was obviously, if you were excluded from that, you were out of the ball game. They were able to have the all-white Texas primary declared unconstitutional in 1927. In 1948, they were able to have the infamous racial restrictive covenants. There were always ways to deprive deprive blacks of equal access. The covenants came about as a response to the end of residential segregation. And essentially, it was where communities formed improvement associations. Well, the improvement was to keep blacks out of that neighborhood. That was the improvement. And the way that you did it was to agree to insert a clause in their deeds that prohibited the sale of the property to anyone other than a person of the Caucasian race. The NAACP was able, in a case called Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, to render the covenants unenforceable. So the NAACP started an assault on caste. But the problem with the NAACP is that in many ways there were still millions of black Americans who felt that somehow they were not included, that the NAACP did not truly address the grassroots or the masses of blacks. As one scholar put it, the masses of blacks by World War I had this incredible hunger inside to feel worthwhile. Or in the words of Jesse Jackson years later, to be somebody. The NAACP was not able to convey that sense or to work with people, the grassroots, in the way that they felt they were included. But there came along an individual. And it's, in some ways, it's remarkable because he was not an African American, he was a Jamaican by the name of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Garvey created the first mass social movement among blacks in the 20th century. The success of his movement represented the failure of the NAACP to touch the most dispossessed within the African American community. And while it was the most successful social movement, it was also an example of a full-blown black nationalist movement. Many of the elements of Garvey's movement would be reminiscent in the 60s in the Nation of Islam and later in the Black Panther Party and later in the theory that espoused internal colonialism. Garvey, as the Nation of Islam, believed that the only way for the African American to be able to survive was to move away, that second adjustment that I had mentioned, to move away, to create their own country, complete with all the elements of nationalism, territorial nationalism. They wanted to be able to go back to Africa and create their own United States of Africa. They wanted to create cultural nationalism. They rejected European culture. And the emphasis with Garvey was now on African culture. And they would often talk about the glories of the medieval kingdoms of Ghana, Songhay, and Mali. Religious nationalism. Actually, here, Garvey was not terribly concerned about religion, period, but he understood that African Americans were really quite religious. So he took Christianity and simply put a black face on it, to be quite honest with you. The African Orthodox Church, they simply took all the figures of a white Jesus and colored it. Mary was also darkened. What's so interesting about this, I think, is that just recently, we talk about race and how it simply does not seem to be able to go away. We can't get beyond race. Is that there's a Broadway production in which a black man is playing Jesus on Broadway. They have received an incredible number of protests. And in fact, there are those who are refusing to go to the play because a black man is playing Jesus, and the objection of whites to a black man playing Jesus. Forget about the fact that we're talking about a spirit here and the qualities of Jesus. The fact that, again, the perception of race continues. Well, Garvey felt the same way that these whites feel today about a black playing Jesus in the play. This one woman was asked why they were changing Jesus and the other white symbols in their church, and she said, look, no white Jesus would ever do anything for me. It could have only been a black Jesus. So therefore, I would not worship a white Jesus. But the truth is that even though you colored, you darkened Jesus, the theology was still the same. But this was a concession. Cultural nationalism, territorial nationalism, but the most important, and also the link between this and later on in terms of internal colonialism, was economic nationalism. Garvey correctly perceived, as did other African Americans, that economically blacks did not own anything. That racism had precluded the establishment of a black economic structure that would allow them to compete with the majority group. Now, I should point out that that was the big difference between Du Bois and Washington some years earlier. Washington, Du Bois said, only wants to create an economic structure that would allow blacks to live. They'll take the most menial Negro jobs they will be given just to survive. His goal was to be able to create an economic structure that would challenge friendly, but compete with the dominant group. For if they did not, blacks would always remain the drawers of water and the hewers of wood. Garvey felt the same way. Garvey believed that if blacks were to be able to be free, and freedom was synonymous with economic freedom, that they would have to create an economic program. This was the most popular part of Garvey's program, the idea of creating, in a sense, community control of the economic resources. And so as a result, Garvey created economic nationalism, which consisted of the Negro Factories Corporation and the Black Star Line, which was not only to take blacks back to resettle in Africa, but it had a much more important reason. It was to create the beginnings of an international transatlantic trade between America, South America, and Africa, controlled and owned by black people to create capital. As wonderful in many ways as Garvey was, by 1923, Garvey was arrested, imprisoned for using the mail to defraud. But Garvey's goals continued long after he was in jail. In the 1930s, something happens. You have a slight, in a sense, departure from black protest. In the 1930s, traditional protest takes a second seat now to protest that emphasizes economic solutions in two ways. Here, economics is important. You have a series of don't buy where you cannot work campaigns. This would also be very important in the 1960s. And you begin to have now, and this is crucial for understanding the success of blacks as we move in the 30s and 40s, the rise of the alliance between labor. I don't have time to go into it today, but it is a fantastic and great story of organized labor's involvement with Walter Reuther and others into helping push race relations in America during the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. By the 50s, you have now the end of the era of legalism. The NAACP has won every case basically with Brown versus the Board of Education that it can. But still, there are things that are left undone. And as a result, now you have another adjustment. You have this moving against now, but with the program of nonviolent direct action. You have leadership characterized by Martin Luther King, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, and many other groups. By the 1960s, even with all the achievements that blacks had made, the NAACP by 1965 had dismantled virtually every law that stood in the way of exercising first-class citizenship. It was completely successful. By 1965, the nonviolent direct action movements had been completely successful in creating a new moral climate in America of sensitizing whites to the problems of race. And in fact, between the 40s and the 60s, you have a great sensitizing the whites. There are more whites who are supportive of blacks in the 60s than ever before. But then there is still something missing. And perhaps King stated it best. When after all the successes that he had made in the South, opening up, getting rid of separate but unequal facilities, he realized one day that there still remained the economic programs. That was the unfinished agenda of the civil rights movement. With all of the rights that they had obtained during the civil rights movement, without economic equality, without equal access to economic resources, blacks would still remain second-class citizens. I recall one day in one speech he said, "I wish that I could stay on the mountain, but I can't. That I've got to go into the valleys among the teeming industrial cities with the masses of poverty and unemployed people." You begin to see the change now in direction. At the same time King was advocating a change in direction, you also have people who've come, African Americans who now come to doubt whether King's program or the NAC's programs really gave blacks anything. They denounced them as assimilationists. The most important among these certainly was the Nation of Islam, headed by Malcolm X. We can see this in 1969 with the March on Washington. In some ways, that was the high point of the civil rights movement, because behind the scenes, the coalition that had brought about so many changes was unraveling. Younger blacks, particularly those from a different generation and from the inner cities, did not measure success by the same yardstick that those who came from the South. They had always been able to ride on the same buses as whites in the North. What they were concerned about was this vicious cycle of poverty It was the limitations that they felt existed in these cities. So what you begin to have, beginning with the philosophies of Malcolm X, is the belief that there is something different about the black community, unlike the white community. There is something that is more permanent about black immigrants versus white immigrants. Beginning in the 50s, even conservative sociologists, the eminent Kenneth Clark, used the term that blacks were actually living like colonies, which was a remarkable comment from a conservative black sociologist. By the 1960s, many people, particularly blacks who belonged to what they call the black militant movement and the grassroots movement, began to see that the black community was not like any other community in America. That in many ways it functioned like a colony. And therefore the term internal colonialism began to be used more and more frequently. That the black community, like a regular colony in a mercantilistic sense, was a place that was geographically segregated, which was contained, in which blacks did not, within their community, control the educational, the social, and most importantly, the economic institutions of their community. And that this wasn't simply caste anymore, because there were differences. There had been certainly white ghettos. There had been Jewish ghettos. But the difference was that these ghettos often simply were voluntary places where the immigrants first came to be among their own ethnic group, but within 1 or 2 generations, they were allowed, because of their color, to move and become a part of the larger community. At the most, it lasted 2 generations. They were able to move and become, I guess, a part of the mainstream. That did not happen for African Americans. And even in those communities that contained, that persisted on retaining that sort of ethnicity, as in Chinatown among the Asians, this was also by choice. It was because of economic means. It was big money to create Chinatowns. They did not see this as oppression because it was a community that they, in fact, it was something desirable because they made a great deal of money as a result of these communities. But the black community was a permanent community. That their decisions about their institutions were not made by black people themselves within those communities. That decisions were made for them outside the black community. In other words, the black community was a powerless community. That if you look at statistics in terms of ownership, blacks did not in the 60s own most of the capital in their own communities. Every other immigrant group owned more capital in the black communities than blacks themselves. One of the goals of black power advocated by Stokely Carmichael in the book Black Power was the goal of community control. And most important among that was economic control. But like a colony, blacks believed they were being contained, They were being restricted, and the agency that kept them contained and restricted was the police department. There certainly is no example of bitterness in terms of race relations. We talk about O.J. Simpson today. I mean, history tells us everything. I mean, if we look back at history, we understand these things. It is only people who don't understand the history, who don't understand the complexity of a case like O.J. Simpson. If you look at what took place in the black communities over the 20th century, that the police force was viewed by blacks, and I suspect, as many scholars argue, by whites as a force to contain them, to keep them safe from African Americans. When I first started, I wanted to quote you this, a quote from the work I'm working on in me. It just struck me that here is a man who is the president of the Miller Homes, writing in the Journal of National Realtors in 1944, and he makes this comment. He says, quote, "There is no fear among our white people so great as the fear of the Negro." God, it conveys so much. And they believed that because of this fear that the police force was to act, the blue line was to be drawn around the black communities and to keep these colonists within these well-defined areas. Even as blacks assumed control of cities as whites moved out, in many ways, they were still the victims of a kind of external, distant control from people who owned them, who owned the wealth, or who made decisions for them in state legislatures. There was an article that came out in the 1960s, again by Robert Blauner, at the same, the author of an article called Internal Colonialism. Majority black cities / a hollow prize. Majority black cities a hollow prize. He predicted then that no matter how many blacks became mayors of these cities, no matter how many councilmen they were elected, that these majority black cities would simply still become ghettos because they had no economic base. Or in other words, they did not own anything. And that the decisions made about things like annexation, things about relocating capital were often made by the state legislatures, which were generally white legislatures who were hostile to these increasingly black majority cities. So this sense now of being a colony, a group of people who were not allowed to share voluntarily in or deciding at what point to become a part of the mainstream, does not control itself economically, continues today to suffer. And in fact, we see more and more it's a reemergence of this notion today of internal colonialism being advocated. Somehow, as historians, we have got to create a new framework, one which is inclusive, of everyone. Well, it is hard to rush in so many years in a few minutes, but we've hit some of the highlights of the adjustment of blacks have made in the 20th century and certain trends.